First off, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us as we continue the spring portion of the 2021 Lectures in Mathematics Education series. Today's speaker is Dr. Deborah Loewenberg Ball, joining us from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Lectures in Mathematics Education series is sponsored by the Herman and Roche Math Initiative and the University of Southern California's Rossiter School of Education, with the goal of highlighting important research targeted at improving teacher effectiveness in mathematics education. We're thankful to be able to provide access to the series virtually and for our guest speakers and everyone joining us in this digital space. Today, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Deborah Loewenberg Ball, who will be giving a talk titled Making Mathematics Teaching Work, Raising Its Power to Disrupt White Supremacy. Dr. Ball is the William H. Payne Collegiate Professor of Education at the University of Michigan and Arthur F. Trunall Professor and the Director of Teaching Works. She taught elementary school for more than 15 years and continues to teach children every year. Additionally, Dr. Ball's research focuses on the practice of teaching, using elementary mathematics as a critical context for investigating the challenges of building relationships with children and helping children develop the agency and understanding. Her current work centers on ways to improve the quality of beginning teaching to advance justice and disrupt racism, marginalization, and inequity. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us. And at this point, I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Deborah Loewenberg Ball.
Sorry, you'd think with living on Zoom these days, I would be much more fluent at getting myself into this. Good evening, or good afternoon, I guess, for all of you. You'll notice that although it's marginally light here and there's snow, just to entertain you, within the next hour, it will go from that light to being completely dark. But I'm really honored to have been invited to be part of this series. I would have liked it a lot better to come and be with all of you in person, but this is where we are. I wanted to open by acknowledging some invisibilities that are important to me to name in my talk. First, I want to, with some humility and I think caution, acknowledge the land that I'm standing on. The more that I've thought about this and learned about it over the last several years, I recognize that there are many complexities with making land acknowledgements. And yet, as I continue to learn about it and to consider what it means to make one or not to make one, I'm choosing still to go ahead and to acknowledge the land on which I'm standing, knowing that I will continue to learn and change my mind as I understand more about the complexity of this. But I want to name that where I am right now is on the land of the state of Michigan, and that the University of Michigan itself resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary homelands of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. The university itself was founded on the proceeds of the sale of land that was ceded by these indigenous peoples through the Treaty of Fort Meigs, with the promise that their children would receive a free education at the University of Michigan, which has never happened. I think I do take inspiration, as well as acknowledging this land, that the indigenous people on whose land I stand and where I do my work remind me and remind all of us that the land itself is the teacher from whom these peoples have learned since the beginning of time. The indigenous peoples on whose land we stand here, and that you all stand wherever it is that you are, remind us of the power of teaching through the lessons that peoples have learned through the land that they stand on and the waters surrounding it, and the ways in which the land and the waters have powerfully shaped the past, the present, and the future. As I said, I'm offering this acknowledgement even as I acknowledge my own complicity in the complexity of this and my white privilege. I commit to continue to interrogate my own actions and what it means for me to say and do these things, and how my actions can align with my decisions to say these sorts of things. And I understand that I will make mistakes and will continue to learn from them as I'm continuing to try to improve what it means for me to contribute to dismantling oppression. My talk will actually pick up this theme, but that's one form of invisibility, that we're all standing on other people's land, often ignoring that, and that has been so erased from the histories that most of us have had access to study. A different sort of invisibility that I always want to acknowledge is the labor of all of the people who made it possible for us to be in connection with one another at this talk. it's no small thing that across the states in this country, and I think beyond the borders of the United States, there are people gathering here to talk and to think, and that is no small thing. And it took a lot of work, not only by people whom you can see organize this, but lots of people making all of these technologies work, the things that make it possible for my own home to have internet, and all of us, and all of these things that go unacknowledged and on which we're so dependent. And I really, this would have been true even in a normal talk if I were there, that there are people who make these things possible, but I feel even more profoundly aware of that, and how infrequently we remember to acknowledge and thank the many people who are making all of this possible for us. And really, the third form of invisibility is the topic of my talk. So I'll put up my slide now and just explain how I'm thinking about that. So the title of this talk, Making Mathematics Teaching Work, Raising Its Power to Disrupt White Supremacy, is kind of a double entendre. It's intended to have a double meaning. In other words, the invisibility on which this talk focuses is what you might think of as a kind of hidden curriculum of white supremacy that permeates schooling. But it's also, I want to highlight and lift up the invisible power that we have to join together in trying to dismantle the power of that hidden curriculum. It's hardly hidden, but the fact that it exists and permeates everything we do, and certainly permeates educational practice, means that the more we can name it and collectively work to understand how it operates, the more possibility there is of working together to cease being complicit in its perpetuation. So raising its power has in it both a mathematical meaning, that is powers and exponential, but to recognize the exponential power that we could have together as we would work on this. So I'm going to begin by acknowledging, or just making a statement of acknowledgement, which is that I think across the last year, I would be willing to say that there seems to be an increasingly shared recognition that racism is systemic, and it's rooted in the histories and institutions. I say increasingly shared because this is hardly news, and particularly there are groups of people for this is not news at all. So I'm deliberately saying that there may be a broader sense of increasingly shared awareness of this, about the systemic nature of racism. I think there are many examples of this that are systemic, and I just picked a few to have on the slide. So I think you can recognize most of these. There's the systemic racism and oppression that are represented in policing, and the way the policing, the movement to defund the police is all part of that system. There's the system of housing that has to do with redlining, the long historic roots of that. There's the history around the criminal justice system. There's the healthcare system, and there's certainly everything we know about the history of voting rights. And there are many other systems like this that operate in our society that are part of this, what I mean when I say there's systemic racism. Racism operates within these systems. And this is not news, but it's also that there's a broader sense of what that means. And you hear much more often people invoking these terms of systemic racism. That doesn't necessarily mean we all agree on what it means, but there is a growing possible awareness that we might be able to use. I will say, however, that despite whatever you may think about the broader sense in which you hear people talking about it, the connections to our everyday practice when we talk about systemic racism are often left really unclear. And it's on that I want to focus today, because the consequences without making those connections is that we all complicitly interact with and continue to maintain these systems because of the way that we reproduce them through what I'm going to call today normalized practices. And I'll explain more about this as I go. But when I say normalized practices, I'm thinking of things that are so taken for granted and so have become norms that they almost at times seem to be taken for granted, and we aren't necessarily aware of our own role. So when you think back to those systems that I just showed you a few minutes ago, one thing that we often don't make the connection to that I want to start with is that the people, those systems are maintained by people. It's fine to say they're operated at a macro level, they're historical, they're structural, they're institutional, and so on. But we have to acknowledge and understand that those systems are both created by and maintained by people. And I want to just show some of those that connect to the very systems I just showed you. So we have real estate agents, we have police officers, of course. We have physicians and other healthcare workers. We have poll workers. We have people as those we saw in violent insurrection at the Capitol. We see people, and all of those people, I think it's crucial to acknowledge, were at one time children in classrooms. I think about this often as somebody who taught third grade and fifth grade and first grade. I watch the things that I see going on, when I see violence, when I see reports of violence, the things that we've been inundated with, and I keep seeing these images in my mind that each of those people was at one time a child. And that makes me think about what it is that we're doing that helps these people grow up to be people who can help to maintain these systems. And that's important. And as educators, that gives us a place to work. And of course, teachers. Teachers were also at one point children in these classrooms. So I want to focus a little bit on what I'm going to call a curriculum of white supremacy. Why it is that this is so easy for people to grow up to be people who are complicit in maintaining these systems, and why it is that the systems often don't seem connected to everyday actions, is because we have an incredibly successful curriculum of white supremacy in this country. I'm going to be focusing on a particular part of what I mean by that, but first let me explain this diagram that some of you might have seen me use before. This is sometimes called the instructional triangle. It's nothing particularly triangular about it. But a few years ago, I altered it a bit to make visible some things that I thought were crucial to represent in this diagram. Essentially, one way to read it is that it acknowledges that what goes on inside of classrooms, that is in the light colored circle at the middle, is the product of the mutual construction and interaction of students with one another, students with their teachers, teachers with the stuff, whatever it is, content or other things that teachers and students interact around, and the way that students bring things around that stuff to the work. So the stuff could be mathematics, but it could also be current events and discussion of politics. Could be any number of things. It could be about a disagreement that occurs on the playground. But all of this, just when you look at the inner circle, acknowledges that what goes on in classrooms is mutually co-constructed and is the product of interpretations and constructions that run every which way, which is why the arrows run in multiple directions. But equally important, and perhaps even more important in this diagram, is what is surrounding that white circle that I'm calling environments. So the environments are everything from the history of and legacy of slavery in this country to contemporary policies around testing. It's everything from curriculum guidelines for teachers to things that communities desire of their schools. It's all of the surround, both historical, contemporary, political, social, economic, that surrounds schooling, and in fact surrounds all of us in our everyday life. And it is a soup of things filled with things that you can easily acknowledge to be ways that racism perpetuates itself through our histories, through our institutions, all the things I was just talking about. But notice that the way I've diagrammed the classroom or the school has a permeable boundary around it. So that's what those little like dotted lines around the inner circle are. And arrows signify that the broader environments permeate classroom life because the classrooms are permeable. Now, you could say that's a good thing. Like, how could we possibly have something like culturally relevant pedagogy if it wasn't possible for the surround of the environments in which children live to become part of what comes inside the classroom? We want the outside world to permeate the classroom. We want the classroom not to be sealed off from everyday life. But it's equally important to understand that the harm and the hate and the violence in our surrounding and our histories and our surrounding environments also permeate the classroom. And when I say we have a curriculum of white supremacy, it's to understand the way in which that permeability creates significant challenges for what it would mean to interrupt the constant flow of these histories and these forms of oppression that permeate classroom life. So when I say curriculum, there are some things that we could be talking about that I won't be focusing on today. For example, one part of the curriculum of white supremacy is a well-known huge discrepancy between who the teachers in this country are and who the children are. I am not going to go into depth on this today, but it's important to acknowledge that the curriculum of white supremacy is represented in the who of teaching and of schooling. It makes a very important difference in this for children, both white children and children of color. I'm not going to unpack this, but I want to acknowledge that that's one of the ways the curriculum of white supremacy installs itself. Another place that I could be concentrating would be on the stuff corner of this. So here we could name things that are probably quite obvious to us, or maybe not, which is that the explicit academic curriculum of schooling has in its own representation erased, distorted, omitted, changed, and foregrounded particular ideas about whose knowledge counts, whose stories matter. I was very taken in the last year when we marked the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. And I dug into history books, it's not my field, but learned that although women's suffrage occupies a small part in US history textbooks, a very small part, that in its own right is already important. So there's been very little actually acknowledged that children grew up learning about this. But to the extent they learn, it's a happy story that as of 1920, women had the right to vote and everything was wonderful after that. The history books don't acknowledge that Indigenous women, Black women, other women other than white women didn't particularly benefit from this landmark decision. And yet the history books don't say that. That's an example of erasure. So we could go into other stories that we all know of distortions and erasures. And it's not only in history, it's also in the literatures that are taught, in what's taught about mathematics and about science and other fields, art, music. So the explicit academic curriculum has a particular slant in it that perpetuates whiteness and white supremacy and dominant culture. But I'm not going to deal with any of that because what I want to focus on is the third aspect of the hidden curriculum. And that has to do with what one might think of as the classroom patterns and practices that are shaped by these larger environments, to be sure, and that's what I'm going to talk about, but that are connected to larger patterns like the criminalization of Black people, which is steeped in the legacy of slavery. It's also related to many other aspects of our broader environment, and they permeate the interactions between teachers and students. So I'm going to concentrate on what you might think of as the relational dimensions of the hidden curriculum that represent themselves both in policies, normative practices of schools, and things that we all just carry with us in our bodies and our experiences without always even noticing them. Let me go a little bit further. So I'm going to illustrate the point I'm making about the hidden or explicit curriculum of white supremacy, and in an attempt to connect for myself and for all of us how larger macro patterns of oppression actually permeate the day-to-day, very tiny things that we're doing constantly in schools, and what that has to do with what I said a little while ago about the people who grew up to be people who hate, who create violence, who harm, were all at one point children. So what is it that we're teaching, and how is that connected to the larger patterns? So the pattern I'm picking is the one that has to do with disproportionate punishment of Black girls in schools. And I think these are data that probably many of you are familiar with. This comes from a very comprehensive study that was published, authored by Epstein, Blake, and Gonzalez. The title of the study is Girlhood Interrupted. So if you just look at this diagram, what you see on the left-hand side is the proportions of different forms of punishment that occur in school for Black girls on the left and white girls on the right. So what you can see is that while Black girls, looking at the farthest left bar, comprise about 1 in 6 girls in school, they comprise over 50% of the multiple suspensions inflicted in schools. So that's what we mean by disproportionate. You would not expect there to be such a great difference between the proportion in the population and the proportion of earning those or being inflicted with those punishments. You see just the opposite on the right-hand side, whereas white girls comprise 50% of the girls in school, they account for only 1 in 5 approximately of the multiple suspensions. And you can look at the other single suspensions and so on. Now, what's critically important in looking at these data is to understand what lies underneath them. And what lies underneath them very clearly are subjective teacher judgments. So what these data represent is the punishment of girls with things that have to do with teachers' interpretations of girls, things like seeming to be talking back, being belligerent, acting out, wearing a spaghetti straps to school. We're not talking about things that are like explicitly, clearly violent, like bringing a gun to school or something like that. We're talking about things that are the product of teachers' judgments about whether children are misbehaving. And that is absolutely critical in understanding this, because it will lead now to how we want to try to connect what it is that creates this pattern in ways that we can connect the dots between these data and single events and multiple events inside of classrooms. So I want to connect these systems to everyday normal practice. So the question we're asking in a way is, how does that happen that we see data like this? How can that actually happen, that there's such disproportionate and harsh punishment of Black girls? And I could be talking about Latinas, Latina girls, I could be talking about Indigenous girls. These data are about Black girls. So to do that, I'm going to invite us inside a classroom, and I'm going to, I hope, challenge all of us to understand that as much as we may think this is all obvious, it may be challenging to understand how you connect the dots of those patterns with the places that this happens in moment-to-moment work inside of classrooms. What I'm hoping you'll take away from my talk is not a sense of despair or cynicism or disbelief, but rather to see the ways that whether you're a teacher, a school leader, a researcher, a teacher educator, whoever you are, that you'll see that there are places for you to exercise agency that can actually disrupt the strength of this curriculum of white supremacy. And that's what I hope the talk creates, is the opportunity not to question who's to blame for all this, but rather to see that when we see this and we don't actually use it to leverage the kind of power I talked about at the beginning, then we are complicit in helping it to continue. So try to travel with me inside this classroom and see what we can understand about those opportunities, both how these things happen and what our opportunities are. So I'm going to be showing a video that I'm aware that many of you may have seen before, although I'm going to frame it in some slightly different ways to help us consider the issues that I'm talking about here. So the math problem on which the children will be working that you're seeing is this what apparently simple problem. You can see a number line here, and the question that children have been asked to consider is, what number does the orange arrow point to, and explain how you figured it out. It looks really deceptively simple. And of course, for all of us who learned this long ago, there doesn't seem to be anything complex about it. But I will just caution you, if you haven't taught this grade level, which is middle to upper elementary, that this is actually very difficult. And one reason it's difficult is our very own curriculum, because we introduce fractions and think about fractions so often as parts of wholes, parts of sets, and we see number lines all the time, that the transition to understanding that fractions are actually numbers on the line, can be numbers, not just fractions, is not an easy transition. Children are far more comfortable, even at a very early age, thinking of 1/3 or 1/2 of a pizza or of cookies, but not so clear that the number 1/3 lives on the number line. So this is at the very beginning of a group of children coming to appreciate and being able to place fractions, greater than 1, greater than 2, to read fractions on the number line and to think about equivalent fractions. There's all kinds of mathematics that arises from where they are right now, including the density of a rational line and so on. But what you need to understand is they're at the very beginning. They have just begun to understand this. So at the point we're going to pick it up, they have worked on this problem, which again is at the beginning of their work. They've worked on it independently. They've had an opportunity to talk to other children, and we're going to be watching a very short clip of the whole class discussion of possible ways to name that number. The protagonist in the video we're going to watch are 2 Black girls, Anaya on the left and Toni on the right. I'll say more about them, and so will you, in a little while. But let me tell you what the viewing focus is for today. What I want you to think about is not so much what you would do. I will ask you more about that later. But I want you to try, given your experience, whatever role you play in the educational environment or that you play as a citizen, fair game, what do you think are the most frequent comments that educators, or if you want to broaden it, that people who watch this video say about the 2 girls? What do they say? What do you think the most frequent things are that people say about Toni? What do you think the most frequent things are that people say about Anaya? And the reason I'm choosing to focus it this way are a couple. First of all, I've shown this video easily over 300 times in multiple contexts. So when I say most frequent, I'm talking about what I've actually seen empirically. The second is that this is a way for you to notice that your own living in this soup of white supremacy equips you very well to predict what it is that people usually say. So I'm not really asking you what you think about the 2 girls. I'm asking you to think about what you know about what are normative ways of thinking and talking. So that's my reason for asking the question that way. Don't worry about what you actually think right now. Just what do you think people typically say? So again, we're going to be watching a short clip of a discussion where basically Anaya and then Toni are going to be talking, but you'll see the whole class. And it's the beginning of what is about a 15-minute discussion. I'm going to tell you about the conclusion of the discussion later today. I'm not going to tell you about it right now. So you're seeing the very beginning. Tell me if you can hear the sound, Michael, if for any reason it's not working.
I can't hear the sound.
Me either.
You can't hear the sound? Okay.
No.
I could hear at the very end, it was very low, I think.
Hang on, we'll just reshare it. Just 1 second. Sorry. We're going to start it again, okay? But somebody put, Yvette Solomon, can you put up your thumb if you can't hear, because I can see you? Or maybe put up your thumb if you can hear, that would be more helpful.
What?
Hang on a
Go
second.
ahead, it's your turn. Listen closely and see what you think about her reasoning and her answer.
I put 1/7 because there's.
Did she say 1/7?
Yeah. Because there's 7 equal parts, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7.
Before you agree or disagree, I want you to ask questions if there's something you don't understand about what she did. No agreeing and disagreeing, just all you can do right now is ask Anaya questions. Who has a question for her? Okay, Tony, what's your question for her?
What?
Go ahead, it's your turn.
Why did you pick 1/7?
You could hear it that time, right? Okay. So the viewing focus I had asked you to consider is, what do you think are the most frequent comments? And I'm not asking you to talk about the whole class right now or the whole discussion, but just about Anaya and Toni, because most of the comments I hear are about one or the other of the girls. So take a moment and just think what you know about normative views that permeate everyday classroom life and classroom talk and classroom interpretation, not what you think, but what you think is frequent. And then I'll share with you the ones I hear by far the most often. Just take a moment and make some predictions from what you know. So let's start with Toni. So Toni is the girl who asks, first, did she say 1/7? And then later asks, why did you put 1/7? So that's Toni. These are by far the most frequent comments that I get on this video. One is that Toni is fooling around with another student, whoever she says, like, you did not, and laughing at Anaya. These aren't in order. These are just these are the three most frequent things I hear. The second is that people interpret Toni as being disrespectful to Anaya. That's the second one that's extremely common. And the third is that people infer that Toni knows that Anaya is wrong and is trying to point that out. That may or may not align with what you predicted, but these are by far the most frequent things that people say. So let me tell you what the most frequent things are about Anaya. One is just people are immediately comment that she has the wrong answer. A second is that they say rather emphatically, Anaya should not be left up there with the wrong answer, feeling bad and possibly confusing other children. And the third is that Anaya is being harmed by how Toni is treating her. So we could kind of unpack these for a moment. I don't want to do that quite yet, but I do want to ask, what's the source of these common responses? Where do they come from? So this is an illustration of what I'm trying to bring to the fore, is that when I say normative practice or taken for grantedness, these are things that are so common that they don't get questioned. They're just extremely frequent. And remember that we're going to try to be connecting this back to the patterns we see about what happens to Black girls in terms of the subjective judgments, what happens to them in terms of punishment. So again, I'm focusing in particular on the relational work of teaching between teachers and students. And what I said earlier about the ways in which the environments permeate classroom practice, this is an example of that. So we're trying to figure out, like, what do we understand about what it is about living in the environment that we live in, going to school in the schools that many of us have attended, of living in the society that we live in that causes us as teachers, in my case, as a white woman, to come into a classroom. What am I carrying with me that shapes the way I understand and interpret my students? And that's the kind of thing that we want to try to be examining, because that's what it means to consider how a soup of white supremacy permeates the ways in which we grow up and live, and causes things to happen that are matters of habit. They're not conscious decisions. I'm not even using a word like implicit bias. I'm talking about what becomes normal. So the comments, I saw several of you nodding, are very familiar. They become really common comments. So I want to take a step back for a moment and name something about teaching that creates the situation in which this is happening. So on one hand, and I'm drawing here on the work of Michael Lipsky and Lee Schulman, and what I want to acknowledge is something that I think any of us who has taught or who works closely with teachers in school systems knows extremely well, is that teaching is incredibly constrained by all kinds of external factors. There are policies, there's curriculum, there are testing regimes, and they're probably even more right now, teachers are feeling that pressure that seems to crowd in on them. And one of the things we often hear that causes teachers to leave the work of teaching is the ways in which they went into teaching, think they could be creative, that they could be independent, that they could use their own individual skills to really care for children. They feel they cannot do that. That is real. But what is equally real that creates a complicated situation is that teaching is also highly idiosyncratic and individual. There probably are very few professions that are as idiosyncratic as teaching is, the proverbial kind of behind the classroom door. And we want to try to probe this because neither of these is going to go away. They're both real, but they create some dilemmas because on one hand, you could ask, well, if we know that the broader environment that's filled with racist assumptions about Black girls, for example, or control of Black bodies, and we know that that permeates things we've all grown up with and then shapes how teachers look, you could think, well, how can we control all of that? That's not actually possible. But on the other hand, you have to appreciate that if you leave everything open for that permeable boundary to be fully taken up by individuals, that creates even more space for these things that are part of the harmful experiences we have to permeate everyday practice. So it's a dilemma that's not solvable and is a reality. Both these things are true at the same time, paradoxically enough. So I want to introduce an idea that helps me to understand both why this can happen so easily and what it is that we can do about it. So again, I'm focusing on this very particular part of teachers' relationships with students situated in these broader environments. On the left, I have a transcript of the clip I just showed you. Don't worry about reading it. But the point I want to make here is that every line of that transcript represents something that I'm going to call a discretionary space. That is a moment where a teacher does something, says something, decides to do something, thinks something that can't possibly be controlled by a policy or by any external control. It's a moment of discretion. I'm going to illustrate a couple of them really quickly. Before I started the video that I showed you, the teacher actually said to the class, who would like to try to explain what you think the answer is to this problem and show us your reasoning by coming up to the board. That's what led to Anaya being at the board. Just notice that nothing in that teacher's curriculum, nothing a school principal could say, no policy could shape exactly how that discussion begins. That's a level of control that's not feasible. Teachers exercise discretion, and it would be very different if the teacher said, who has the right answer and will share, or called on a student who seems to always have the right answer. Those are really different openings, and they're at the teacher's discretion. And there are other things that happen in the course of that. Some children aren't sitting up. The teacher could decide to make them sit up. Dante, who shouts "do did not" across the room at TONI, could be told, we don't shout out during class, but the teacher has to use discretion about whether and how to respond to any of these things. What's interesting is that in these 20 lines of transcript, there are 20 of these discretionary spaces in only 1 minute, 28 seconds. So what I conclude from that is that teaching practice is absolutely dense, almost like the number line is dense with rational numbers. Teaching is dense with discretionary spaces. By the way, you could argue that our everyday life is dense with discretionary spaces as we make decisions about how we interpret people who we interact with and so on, but I'm focusing on teaching. So this density of discretionary space is both the way in which the broader environments flow easily into our everyday decisions, interpretations, behaviors, and habitual actions. They're also the places where we can exercise agency to interrupt patterns of racism. And that's where we're going to focus for the rest of the time. So I'm going to focus inside discretionary space 19 on the slide I just showed you. So discretionary space 19 is the one where Toni says, why did you pick 1/7? And is playing with her hair and laughing. So that's a discretionary space. It's a discretionary space because nothing governs how a teacher should respond. You might have views about how the teacher should respond, but as teachers, we're pretty busy. We do things, we move, we have habits, we have things we're used to seeing, and it's a discretionary space. Doesn't mean you can't slow it down and deliberately do something different. In fact, I'm arguing we'll need to, but it is a space in which nothing can control that except the teacher's own habits and ways of being. So what's going on in this discretionary space? One fact is that Toni is asking a question of Anaya. Another is that Toni is also laughing and playing with her hair. That's also the case. It's also worth understanding when you think carefully about identities that Toni and I are both Black girls. In fact, the class is predominantly Black children, but they're positioned, you can't see this very well, but it's useful always as teachers to be remembering that these two girls are positioned with different statuses in the classroom. They have different, they carry themselves differently physically, and they perform what they think it means to be a Black girl in this context in really different ways. And I credit my colleague, Macy Golson, and other scholars for helping me understand this way of thinking about Black girlhood. So in this discretionary space, nothing happens this slowly, but there is a question of what to do next. You could ignore Toni, you could move on, you could rebuke her. So the question that we want to ask now gets a little closer to teaching practice than what I asked you earlier. Earlier, I asked you, what do you think people most often say? Now I want to ask you, what do you know about what you think commonly happens next in classrooms? Again, for those of you who are teachers, I'm not actually asking you what you would do next. I'm asking you, think of all the teaching you've seen and all of what you know inside schools you've been in, and same thing for any of the rest of you who are familiar with schools. What do you think are the common things that get said next or done next? And we're going to focus entirely on Toni. We could repeat the same thing I'm doing right now with what you think would get most commonly said to Anaya when she goes to the board and says 1/7. And we could do the same analysis. I'm just not going to do both of them, but you could try it. It's equally interesting. But because I started with the patterns of punishment of Black girls, I'm focusing on Toni with her presentation in this math discussion. So the question is, what do you think? What happens next? So I'm going to give you a moment to think again, not what you would do, but what do you think are the most common things that happen next to when this happens, to when Toni or another girl like Toni does something like this in a class? Just think, what might the teacher, what are the things the teacher might say? So again, I'm going to draw on what I've heard from asking people and watching what people do. One very common thing is, Toni, when you're ready to participate appropriately by not playing with your hair and laughing and have a question to ask, I'll come back to you. A second is, this one's particularly interesting to me. You need to be a better listener, Toni. Anaya already explained how she picked 1/7. Who else has a real question for Anaya? And the third is, Toni, in this classroom, we're respectful of one another. When you're ready to be respectful, you can rejoin the discussion. So you can see how those basically map on to some of what I mentioned earlier are the common comments that get made. But I'm sure that you've heard not only these kinds of things being said, but almost this language, this sort of, when you're ready, I'll come back, is a very frequent refrain that one hears frequently. Another would be, when you're ready to pay attention, I'll come back to you. When you're ready to engage, I'll come back to you. Sometimes that leads to, as in the third comment, asking a student to step away until they're, quote, ready to do something. So now I want to ask, these are all discretionary exercises of discretion. What does each of these different exercises of discretion actually do? So we have the possible next moves that I named. And we also, so here are the possible next moves that I read. So the question is, what are the results? If those are the things that typically get said, now remember, I'm trying to connect the dots back to those patterns of Black girl punishment. What are the results of these three very common normalized comments? In all three cases, Toni is excluded from the discussion. That's worth noticing. No matter which one of these things gets said, she's excluded in different ways. In the third, she's rebuked in front of the class as having been disrespectful. In the second, she's named as not listening, which is pretty peculiar because we heard her say, did she just say 1/7? There's clear evidence that she's listening really carefully, perhaps even more than some of the other children. So naming her as not listening is actually false. There's a direct evidence. But all three of these sideline her, and in all three cases, the mathematics that she's bringing to the discussion is excluded as well. And for those of you who think deeply about elementary mathematics, what she asks is the most important question. Why did you say 1/7? So Anaya has given an incredibly robust mathematical explanation. Everything about Anaya's explanation is absolutely mathematically rigorous, with one exception. She doesn't yet fully appreciate that the hole on the number line is always the interval from 0 to 1. And if you remember that I explained earlier that that's the new point when you move from area models to the number line, that's not surprising. That's a big change. You can have 1/4 of 5 pizzas, but on the number line, 1/4 is always going to be less than 1. And that is a new idea. Other than that, she gives a very complete mathematical explanation. She's very poised at the board. Toni, quite likely, is a little thrown by this. At least it's plausible, and wonders, that makes sense. So to interpret her as trying to somehow not contribute, asking, why did you pick 1/7 is actually the question you would order up if you could pick a question to be asked. And yet, these common responses sideline that. So what does this do? First, let's think about what responding in this normalized way does to Toni. First of all, as I said, her contributions aren't seen as appropriate or valuable. The fact that she actually is participating and attending is made invisible. Her identity as somebody engaged in mathematics isn't supported. And altogether, this is a dehumanizing kind of mood. It focuses in a particular way, positions her as a troublemaker, and doesn't see her as a genuine 10-year-old, perhaps nervous, perhaps a little silly, trying to think about this mathematics. But it's worth understanding, and here's where I want to broaden from the harm that can be done to both Toni or Anaya, if we did the analysis with Anaya, is what's going on for the other children. Remember that I showed you that picture earlier of all the people who were at one time 3rd graders in our nation's schools and what they learned about race, about racism, about all kinds of things that contribute to some of the things we see going on in our systems. Let's think about what other children in the class are learning. Toni's being named as a distraction, as disrespectful of Anaya, and as somebody merely playing with her hair. That's how she's being positioned in front of other children, including Black children and white children and Latina children. She's also not seen as somebody who can contribute to discussion or someone who asks a good question. And these combine overall to be one more experience that children have in school of Black girls as troublemakers or as people who are not good at math. This adds up over time. And this is a repeated kind of experience that not only Toni and Anaya have, but that their classmates have as well. So this is what I'm talking about when I say there's a curriculum of white supremacy that permeates the relational work of teaching. This all seems so normal, and yet it permeates the experiences of what everybody is learning about Black people, about math and who's good at it, and all these things that contribute to what we see when we grow up. Now, as a white woman teacher, as this classroom has, with predominantly Black children, we can see one set of things. Again, we could repeat this analysis. We haven't really seen the teacher. If the teacher had a different identity, was male, identified as Latino, whatever you want to swap out, there are other things to consider about those interactions, but we still have this question of how normalized practice repeats itself and what children and their classmates learn. So in the last bit of the talk, I want to ask, so Deborah, you said that this is supposed to be something that can help us disrupt these patterns that repeat themselves between the macro and the micro. So I want to start by showing you what happens after Toni asks her question.
Okay, Toni, what's your question for her? Go ahead, it's your turn.
Why did you pick 1/7?
Let's listen to her answer now. That was a very good question. Can you show us again how you figured out why you decided 1/7?
So at that point, Anaya explains it very carefully again. And I'm not going to show you more, but I will tell you more about the end of the discussion in a few minutes. So what I want to talk about now is how a discretionary space can be used to disrupt instead of perpetuating the patterns of how Black girls are repeatedly positioned. So what went into this? First, what went into it was that reading Toni is actually asking a question that she means. Hearing her as asking something, as I said to you a few minutes ago, that actually advances the mathematical point of the lesson. And it reinforces her mathematical identity, and not choosing to read her body with her playing of her hair as a disruption, but actually focusing instead on her mathematical thinking. What does it mean for the rest of the class? Taking that move in that discretionary space means that other children hear Toni being read as asking an important mathematical question. She's positioned as an important contributor to the math discussion. And more globally, children see a teacher attending to a Black girl's thinking and not as someone making trouble. It's the sort of the complement of what I just showed you of what happens typically. This is one tiny little move in a discretionary space. Am I arguing that that one move disrupts white supremacy? Of course not. But in the same way that the repeated pattern of the way Black girls are positioned helps us understand how we get to those data on Black girl punishment. So I've walked through this analysis in multiple ways, different kinds of designs, showed the video in different ways to lots of people. And even after we get to the point where we just ended, these are the three most frequent things I hear. First, Toni looks older than Anaya. Maybe she got held back. I think I would pull her out of this setting. So what that represents is the way in which, as the report that I quoted from shows, the ways of what's called the adultification of Black girls, and the ways in which their size leads them to be seen as older than they are and held to behave and act in ways that aren't even appropriate. In this case, Toni actually isn't older, but that tendency to read her actually showed up in a journalist who watched this talk at one point, this video, and wrote, interestingly, I challenge you to think about this, described Toni as tall, lean, and muscular. Did you see anything in the video I just showed you that could lead you to determine that Toni is tall, lean, and muscular? I don't think Toni stands up in the video I showed you. So that's a very explicit example of this kind of perception of a Black girl. A second is I could never let Toni get away with that in my classroom. I just couldn't do it. I hear what you're saying. I just couldn't stand for that. I just couldn't do it, which is a good example of what I mean by habitual action. It becomes so ingrained so that it's normalized, and also we feel it. You feel it in your body, like I can't have that going on. And the third is I'd be really, really concerned about Anaya and how she feels being up at the board like that. All three of those comments happen after the work we just did. So I think this is a good moment to share with you what happens about 14 minutes after where we stopped, which you can't know when you watch the video, of course, and neither can anyone else I've showed it to, but it helps me keep my foot to the pedal about why the discretion we exercise has consequences. So you saw what did happen. Toni's question was affirmed, Anaya answered it, and the discussion proceeded for about another 14 minutes. Again, on a critical mathematical idea, the goal of which was to establish that on the number line, the whole is from 0 to 1 and begin to be able to name fractions on the line. So 14 minutes after that, there was a conclusion to the discussion. Look who's at the board providing the summary. It's Toni. Toni summarizes what the class has concluded from the discussion, because following her question to Anaya and several other people contributing other things, collectively they arrive at a conclusion about how one names fractions on the line. And on the right, you see Anaya's journal entry from the day. She writes, I did well on my goal today because my goal was to share my ideas with the class, and I did. I went up to the board and I shared my idea of the class on fractions. Both girls on their exit ticket were able to identify a more complicated fraction correctly using the 0 to 1 interval as a correct placement of the line, as could all of their classmates. So the class arrived at a mathematical big step forward through the contributions initiated by Anaya and Toni, and not interrupted by normalized reactions to either of them that typically would have both harmed them, taught other children in the class things about Black girls that perpetuate these systems of racism, and interfered with the progress of the mathematics. So these discretionary spaces and the ways that we use them, the arrows go the other way too. We are raising the adults that will be voting in 2032, that will be the police officers, that will be the healthcare workers, that will be teachers, will be poll workers. That's who we're educating. So these ways we use our discretion both may reflect the soup we grew up in, but it helps to perpetuate it. or we have the option to not do that. So what does that mean for us? What would it actually take to learn to use these discretionary spaces in teaching in ways that disrupt the curriculum of white supremacy instead of inadvertently or not reinforcing and perpetuating it? So first, you got to understand what typically fills these discretionary spaces. And what I mean by that is what shapes these habits. So I'm saying it comes from a broader experience in a society dominated by racism and whiteness. But exactly what is it that leads teachers to have these habits? So one is teachers' experiences growing up in a society filled with racism and oppression in classrooms where the things that I just showed you are typical. We've all seen those in schools when we were kids. So we grow up with that. It's also fair to say that these normalized practices, these ways of treating behavior in classrooms, rebuking children, insisting on respect in particular ways are also part of professional education, teacher education. And once people are in schools, because these are normalized, they get reinforced through principals' observations of teachers, the things that teachers say to one another. That's what it means for it to be normalized. This isn't a blaming analysis. This has to do with what it means that these are systemic and normalized. But it is worth understanding that professional education doesn't intervene on our experiences very effectively at all. That's an old problem that we all have read about. Teacher education is not a strong intervention. And furthermore, that teacher education actually teaches this. So what does it take to disrupt the patterns through which this particular Black girl or other Black girls like her are marginalized? This helps us think about teacher education, professional education, and the like. First, as I've said a few times, one would have to be able to see Toni's question as key to the mathematical lesson. I announced it. I didn't take it up with you in great detail, but I just said it. So what does it take to be able to see that? It actually requires teachers to know mathematics subtly and flexibly, because it isn't obvious instantly that asking why did you pick 1/7 is so key to the discussion. The only way you can see that is if you really try to unpack the complexity of the number line as an object, a mathematical object, and what is going on there to name a fraction. So to hear Toni as saying something crucial requires mathematical knowledge, which, by the way, also is something that people don't develop through their experiences in school, another cycle. A second is what Danny Martin and Macy Golson called taking as axiomatic the brilliance of Black children, and therefore Toni and I. What they mean by this is making the assumption that Black girls are capable, that they're contributing, that they're smart, and not having that to be something that has to be proved. So what does that involve? That involves interpreting Toni as asking a mathematical question that she actually cares about. So that can be practice of how one learns to read children. But all of those are still in the head. Like, do you know enough math to hear Toni's question? Do you actually see Black girls as brilliant and capable and smart? But you also have to do something. My whole point is this is about habitual action, not just like what's in your head. So you'd have to have a repertoire of practices that you could do in these moments that can be adapted and used, that clearly don't fall into the normal, but allow your class to move forward. So like the example of saying, that was a good question, let's take it up again. That sounds so little, but the accumulation of those really matters. So seeing yourself as a disruptor requires commitment and learning to figure out what you do to change the way those arrows are operating on your practice. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because on one hand, it requires things we know, like knowledge, awareness, beliefs, commitments. It also requires a lot of skill and judgment. This is not a recipe. So there are a bunch of things that we've been talking about a bit today about understanding how white supremacy permeate our institutions. It also means like continuing to think about oneself and one's own racial identity and what that means for your position in this history. It's coming to understand what I mean by a discretionary space. I don't mean a moment, I don't mean a decision, I mean how much teaching is permeated with agency, with opportunities for agency, and being committed to find ways to use those spaces to disrupt patterns. And then there are like various skills, like knowing content deeply enough to be able to hear and use children's ideas, developing language and reasoning. There are many things that involve adaptability that can allow you to act in the moment. So moving on, just to be clear what I mean, a discretionary space is the spaces and moments in teaching and in life where we can either act from habit and from patterns of white supremacy that are institutionalized in experience and in professional training, or they can be used, they can be exploited to dismantle anti-Black racism and white supremacy. They work both ways. So they're really like a hopeful concept, because once you recognize where you have agency, it allows you to start moving differently or to educate or coach teachers differently. I guess an important point to mention here is what I've learned from my colleague Imani Gafni, and is also clearly in the writing of Abraham Kendi, is there's no neutral. You're either part of the ongoing system by doing things that seem normal and taken for granted, or you're actively learning to see how even small acts are part of the perpetuation of this curriculum. So there's no neutral. We're either complicit in it or we're actively disrupting it. This isn't individual work. This is our work. This is what it means to try to use teaching and the power that it actually could have in our society. We're the ones who educate the people who grew up to be those adults. And our power is actually in our collective efforts to talk about these things at meetings, to figure out how we can make mathematics teaching work in these ways, in these directions, and to learn and grow and share and push forward. There's no end to this. I'm not at the end of my understanding of this. It's a long-term journey. But I hope by being willing to talk about it more openly and see this as part of a system and not something to which we need to defend ourselves, we're individually culpable. We're only culpable if we see this and don't use it to make a difference. So with that, I'll stop. These slides, I will share them. So they'll be posted on my website. You can go there and take them, but I think we have a few minutes for questions or comments or whatever.
Yeah, feel free to post the questions into the chat box, and then we'll get to as many of them as we can.
Maybe we should just start with one person having a question so we don't wait for everybody to type. Would that be a good idea?
Sure.
All right, this is Mary Helen. I don't know if you see my little square somewhere.
Hi, Mary Helen, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. It was really wonderful, like such a great, on the ground demonstration of how these things play out. I was curious about your use of the word curriculum and your use of the word pedagogy. Early in the talk, you gave an example of the history books talking about women's suffrage, right? And really showing how the curriculum itself is racist, sexist, right? Not inclusive. And here, I don't see racism in the design of the prompt. It's really implicit in the pedagogical strategies that a teacher might use to manage the discussion around the prompt. And so I wonder if differentiating those would be useful, because the notion that a mathematical curriculum, which doesn't inherently have social content and it could be racist, it may be confusing to people, but the notion that the pedagogical practices could be racist may kind of go straighter at the nature of the problem.
That's a great question, Mary Helen. I probably should keep thinking about it. The way I've been thinking about it recently, and I'd be glad for pushback or comments, is that in some ways taking up the notion from curriculum theory of the hidden curriculum, that the hidden curriculum is all the things that are being taught that we don't name explicitly. My only hesitation with calling it the hidden curriculum is not very hidden. So the hidden curriculum typically is things like power dynamics and behavioral norms. So I was kind of borrowing from that idea by having an expansive view of curriculum as what's taught and learned in school. And what's taught and learned includes like whom you encounter as teachers or scholars or whatever, what you're explicitly taught in the academic curriculum, but then what you're taught and what you're learning from like watching the things that I was showing. So it might be confusing, you may be right, but right now I'm experimenting with thinking of curriculum in that broad sense of like what gets taught and learned, whether it's named as a set of like objectives, or whether it's still explicitly being taught. If that makes sense, but I might be wrong in that use.
All right, we have another question here from Julie. It's also not culturally relevant or responsive. Oh, this is a comment. Culturally responsive, it is a reflection of dominant narrative of what constitutes math knowledge and ways to connect math content. We also have a question here from Peter. There also seems to be something in the example you shared about joy and playfulness as a tool for disruption. Laughter and play challenge the right way to do a discussion schooling. I'm curious if you see this playing across your work and if you see teachers drawing from that practice.
I'm not surprised that Peter's asking me that from the opportunity I had to talk with him earlier, and it's a great question. And I think I do see this. I don't think I'm in a position to say a lot about it, but I think what counts as engagement and what counts as communication and interaction is deeply racialized and cultural. So the things that I'm trying to understand, like why Toni is seen as being disrespectful when there's not any reason to necessarily choose to see her that way, is a racialized.
Looks like,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, there you are.
I got like kicked off the Zoom for a minute, but anyway, I think that's a good thing that we should take up more. And I definitely see it. I don't think I have a lot to say, but there is a lot of the way that the Black children in our research get read that has to do with their like engagement and joy and like some of the things you're talking about that then get read as misbehavior, which seems to speak well to the, or directly to the subjective judgments and the over punishment issue. But I think you're also asking about the positive, like how to think about encouraging and valuing play. Probably knowing what you said to me earlier. There was a comment from Julie about the mathematics. I don't see Julie right now. I don't know about it's quite right that the mathematical content itself is another site. And when I introduced my framework, I was saying today I'm actually not going to treat the content corner of the diagram, but they could do the whole talk just on analyzing how mathematics is represented as content and as practice. Would be another place. I chose to focus on the relational, what I'm calling sort of the relational elements of the work of teaching.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Oh,
I don't know if that's Helia. I don't know how to pronounce it.
It's Helia.
Helia, thank you. Yes, I think there's quite a lot that could be done with that as well. And again, I chose not to take that up today, but I was hoping that the framing of thinking of all the parts that can contribute and comprise this curriculum of white supremacy offers an opportunity to dive in from that angle and probably combine them. But in this case, I chose to hold some things fixed and focus on these sort of constant like density of interactions and relationships that are one of the ways that this curriculum is being taught and learned. The culture in the classroom. Well, that's an interesting question too from Norma Gordon. So another piece of the work would be how do you disrupt the mathematical norms that pervade our society about what it means to be smart at math and what it means to be, what collective work actually looks like. Schools are so individualistic, which is actually also a manifestation of whiteness. But what's interesting about this discussion, if you ever wanted to see like from beginning to end, is it's not possible really to watch it as one child says something, it's right or wrong, the next child, it's like not a sequential talk. It's like a stream. Somebody says something, someone else like kind of adds on, like the kind of conversations we wish we could probably have often. There's no moment where somebody's right or wrong. I think by the end, that's why I made the point about Toni summarizing. It was kind of like they had finished figuring out how they were going to treat reading fractions. And I'm in the middle of trying to analyze how that is different than a math discussion where kids share one after the other. There's something different about how the kids are talking. And I think that has something to do with this point that Norma's interested in about what kind of a space is it? Like, what does it mean to be contributing? What does it mean to be doing smart things in math as opposed to who is smart? I think it's a very good question and it's an important part of this. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that would be helpful, Richard. I'm hoping that in part this talk, it's something I've been thinking about, I've been working on for a while. I hope it gives some openings for you to both critique it, but also take up pieces of it. I think there are places that we could pair off. Like one of my points about this being habitual action is a slightly different take than thinking of everything as implicit bias, because if it's habitual, I was talking about this earlier with some people, that there might introduce some different ways of what it means to break habits, whether they're, we know there's quite a lot of research on habits. So is there a way to think about what it takes to break habits that could be useful here? teaching is a space in which everything isn't going to be like in your head. It's like you're moving so fast and doing so much. So if you habitually read Toni as a troublemaker, what would it take to begin having a different habit of how you read her? And one thing I've been taught by quite a few people who've watched the video is we will never know what Toni was actually meaning at that moment. That is not the point. Maybe she was trying to make fun of Anaya. That's actually not the point. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I'm not saying that. But the discretionary space point is we can choose to read children in particular ways. So choosing to read Toni as asking a serious question is a choice and accompanied by an action. And what you see is 15 minutes later, she's at the board explaining something. So that choice has consequences. If you choose to say, oh, come on, I'm pretty sure she's just being disrespectful, that's a choice too. You're not going to know the truth as a teacher, but you do have choices about what you choose to read children as doing. There's a lot of good comments coming in. Thank you for all of this. I really appreciate this. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's also about issues of power. There's a lot here. I'm sorry if it seems like there's like too many layers, but I tried to like pick one path through it to engage you in it. I'm very happy for if any of you wants to follow up at any other point and critique or ask questions. I would be happy for that. I'm just reading the chat.
All right. Well,
Thank you so much for inviting me and for coming tonight under these circumstances. I hope you're all healthy. I hope you, I don't know exactly what the story is and where you are, but things are worse. We just learned today that we have a stay-at-home order for the next 2 weeks in where I'm living. So things are definitely up and down and very harmful for communities where I live. So I hope you're safe. Your families are safe.
Well, to help with passing the time during a stay-at-home order, we do have another lecture series coming up, a presentation by Dr. Robert Berry, coming up on February 11th. I just wanted to plug that real quick. And I want to say again, thank you to Dr. Deborah Loewenberg Ball for her time today and presentation. I think it was very meaningful for a lot of the people in the room, and hopefully it'll be meaningful for anyone who watches in the future. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and everybody's applauding right now, so. All right, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for your incredible hospitality and support of me in this. So thank you. And thank you, everybody. Bye. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.